Okay everybody, what we're going to be doing today is looking at lines and splines and how we can use them for multiple different purposes. In the last video we looked at how we can use a line for a path, so you can check that out if you're not too sure how we did that. But we're going to look at how we can use lines for different purposes. So just a quick recap, you've got create and geometry, but we're not interested in geometry, we are interested in shapes. I know I'm labouring the point here, but there is a distinct difference between a geometric object, something that is made of polygons, and a shape, something that is vector based and made out of lines or curved or points in space that otherwise cannot be rendered. There's a substantial difference. Basic line tool. Now, multiple viewports are your friend for this. I just press Z to square everything back up. One of the things we've covered in class is when you use a line, you can click, you can click, you can click, and by clicking it will always create a straight line. If you click and drag, it will create a curved line. If you realise you don't like that curved line, complete your shape and then go back to it afterwards. Don't delete the whole object if you make the whole shape if you get one thing wrong. Go to the modifier panel, go to Vertex Mode, or you can click Vertex Mode here. It works in exactly the same way as Edit Poly does. And you can click on that one curve. You can move the control points around. You can click on each control point and move them independently, or rotate them, I should say. You can scale them. So you can scale the curve up and down. You can move each individual vertex and each point, and you've got the same control that you had over different elements of an object. So we can modify a segment, which would be the equivalent of an edge, talking about geometry, and you can also move the entire spline itself. One of the key characteristics that make these things interesting is, first and foremost, if you perform a render on that, it is entirely invisible. We can use it as a mold, or we can use it as is. So what I'm going to show you here is how we can use it as is. By clicking on the rendering tab, which by default is closed down, you can enable in renderer and enable in viewport. You can change the thickness of your line. So this is quite good if you want to create an outline for something. If you want to change, by default it will have 12 sides, so it will be quite cylindrical. You can drop that down to 4 if you want something a little bit more square, more angular, perhaps sharper. And that looks quite nice. You could easily imagine that as a logo or an icon for a sci-fi shop or store, something like that. You can also change the angle of your sides. So what I'm doing here, by changing it from 0 to 45, as you can see there, is they're now square on. So rather than being pointy, they're now square. So there's quite nice ways of doing these different things. I'm going to turn that mode off, and I'm going to show you again how we can use this as a mold. So this is Extrude. Again, if you've never ever seen how it's made, go and watch how it's made. There will be a bit in there where they used an extruder. So extruder is where you push something through a mold to end up with the shape, and this is how I want you to imagine we're using this tool here. We have the mold, we have the structure, we are extruding through it by an amount of your choice, positive or negative. Doesn't make a difference, but I always recommend you use positive numbers where possible when you're creating something. As always, I recommend you round those numbers, if at all possible, to a number that you're happy with. And then you can add as many segments as you like. I'm just going to turn on edged faces so I can see those segments being added in. One of the skills I want you to get comfortable with at this point is optimization. So depending on what you want to do with this new piece of geometry that you have created, depends on how many segments you want. If you wanted to apply edit poly to this, and perhaps round these sides, perhaps we're just going to put one in the middle. I'm going to use edit poly, the best tool ever. I might have mentioned that already. I'm going to select all of these vertices, and I'm going to select all of these vertices. Maybe we're just going to scale them down a little bit to create almost looks like an accidental boat. Do you know those swans they have at kind of like a Drake Manor? I think I just built one by mistake. So you could do that, or we could just scale it on one axis. Perhaps if we just pulled it on the X. So you could create different things, or we could scale it inwards. You could create different things. It's up to you. You've got geometry that we can apply edit poly to, so that's one use of this. The other one that we've looked at is lathe. So we looked at these in the cup example in class. Lathe is particularly challenging to wrap your head around because it is unusual. Again, if you haven't seen how it's made, please do so. Find an episode with lathe in it to show you what the engineering term is and how we lathe things. But remember, what you do with lathe is you create the outside edge of your object. Unlike Extrude, where you want a completed loop, I don't want to close this. I'm not going to click on that point. I'm not going to close it. I'm going to hit escape. I don't want to complete that. If I then click lathe as my modifier, by default it will go horribly wrong, because it always defaults to taking, and I'm just going to click the plus and the axis, it puts the axis square in the middle of your line, which is not what we want. We want it at the edge of our line, and I just happen to use the black line, the center of my world, as that. So now I've got something that looks quite a bit like a cup. I always encourage, when you're using lathe, to do a quick render out and to see what it looks like, because it's entirely possible it will look like this. You see how it's inside out? That is because if you're not really accurate with how you position your axis, what it can do is it can identify the object being the wrong way out, or each polygon faces the wrong direction. To explain that properly, remember that's the normal, the direction that each polygon faces. So in this example here, this polygon, just that one there, that would be facing towards, effectively to the right of my screen. However, if the normals are flipped, which is this button here, it will be facing inwards, and because of optimization tools like backface culling during the render pipeline, it would not render the back of that. Remember, backface culling, kill the back face, don't bother drawing it. So there's a little button there built in for flip normals, because this is a commonly occurring issue. You can also change the direction of your axis to get wildly different results if you want to. Just be aware that that will default your axis to its original starting position. So always do a quick render just to see, is it the right way out or is it inside out? To give you a better appreciation of what's going on, you can change the amount of degrees that it is applying to. So 0 degrees does that. A few more degrees performs the full 360-degree rotation. And as always, you can add more segments if you want it to be smoother. So let's go up to 32. And you can just add more. I always recommend multiples of 16 simply because that's the starting one. And as before, I recommend whole values where possible, or even numbers, I should say. So if this were to become a cup, that created the core structure of my cup. And if I wanted to change things, I could go back to when it was a line. Again, just by clicking on line, perhaps I want this to come to more of a point. And I perhaps want that over there, so it's really quite nice and forms a curve. Go back to when I lathed it, brings it to more of a narrow point, more of a kind of the narrow point of a glass. Now it's geometry, I can do whatever I like to it, such as edit poly, best tool ever, may have mentioned it before, and perhaps if I wanted to just grab some vertices, I'm just going to grab that poly, and I'm going to extrude that polygon out. So a little bit about edit poly here. Remember, you can extrude something by a value. One of the things you may not have seen so far is if I click tick, that will be done for that particular extrusion. But if I click extrusion and instead, once I'm happy with it, I can position it as I go. I can also use plus to say, yep, do that, but now do another one, do another one, do another one of the same values. And again, you can always Control Z if you're not happy with it. So I'm just going to create something very briefly that looks like the handle to this cup. Extrude. Extrude. You get the idea. And I could do this in very few pieces, and this is an optimization thing for yourself to decide how many do you think the cup needs to look good and still be efficient. We don't want too many polygons, so we could get away with that. Now, because of the nature of the beast, that's not lined up. So let's line it up. And the top view would be great for this, because I can see it's all on the squiff, which is not really what I like. So I can grab those polys, and I'm going to do this by poly. Oh, sorry, yeah, I'll do it in Vertex Mode. I'm going to grab these vertices and move them across. Again, I'm just going to eyeball this. I'm going to make my selection like so. And I'm going to drag it across so it's broadly in line with that. You get the idea. We could easily square that up. We have a cup. And if you wanted to knock some of those edges off, Turbo Smooth is a very good tool for rounding things off. Suddenly, it looks really quite nice. So, Instant Cup. The other things I want to show you about lines, about splines and non-geometric objects, is that you don't just have to start with lines. We have ellipses, which are exactly as you would expect, so they can be used for different purposes. We have a helix, which is a particularly interesting shape, especially when used. If I just set it to its default values, there we go. So let's just create another one so you can see its default values. Particularly interesting for a path for your camera, as we covered in the previous video, because you can get a nice spinning effect as we go around. Looks like DNA, sometimes useful, a double helix. So if you're doing something sci-fi, you want to be miniaturized, you could do that. You can add as many terms as you like. You can have the radius be the same value if you want it to be nice and parallel. You could have it come to 0 if you wanted it to appear to be a point or a cone. You can add biases to something, so it's more one and less in the other. And all these things can be animated, but we're not too much interested in animation at the moment. I can enable and render, enabling viewport, and it's just pulled the properties that I had before. So for people who remember helter-skelters, well, we've just built a helter-skelter. If you don't know what that is, go Google a helter-skelter and get out more. So what we've got this, and that's a useful thing that we can do. The other thing that's really interesting is text. Because text is a shape, it obeys all the rules that we've just done. If you want to have a big sign on top of an entrance or something into the front of a city, well, extrude your text and turns it from a shape into geometry. And again, you can change your text, whatever you want it to say there. You can also change key information about it, the font, the key properties about it. Let's do Comic Sans just to aggravate people. I think the person it's aggravating more than anyone is me, so we're going to do that. You can also do exactly the same thing. If I remove Extrude, we can enable and render, enable and viewport, and if we give it 12 sides and reduce thickness, kind of looks like you could give a glow effect to that, or you could apply a material to that, so it kind of looks like those neon lights you might see outside of pharmacies or that kind of thing. So different tools for different purposes. Lines and splines are very powerful, and sometimes you'll find that they are a better starting point for an object than starting with geometry. Cups are an example. Anything that's going to be cylindrical is a great tool for using lathe, but don't forget that once it is geometry, you can treat it as geometry by applying Edit Poly or any of the modifier tools to that. Hopefully that's been helpful for you guys. Thank you very much.